So I was fascinated when David sat in on a course that I was teaching, the Art History Survey, and at the end of the year told me what he was working on. He was working on this art cycles topic. And I was fascinated because over the years, whether it was in modern languages when I was involved in the Comp Lit program, or when I returned to visual arts and taught art history, I have always taught these huge first-year survey courses. So whether it was in Comp Lit, where I was looking at, it felt like every cultural production, not just literature, but also art and philosophy and music, I kept seeing these patterns that repeated. And certainly that was the case for the art history course that I taught. And when I would try to talk to my colleagues at conferences about these repeating patterns, art historians did not want to know. No, you can't go that route, they would say to me. And yet, you do see repeating patterns. So when I read what David was working on, this very large look at art cycles over the centuries, I found it extremely interesting, and it seemed pretty valid to me, this DC ratio. And I didn't really understand it very well, but I've read more of what Jim and David have been doing, and it's been a big help. So my question was, can the theory of complexity science be applied to art cycles? Is it useful in terms of understanding the patterns of change in artistic styles? While it's possible to apply complexity science to the larger scheme of art cycles that can be broadly mapped out over a century or more, I thought it would be important to see what materials might be useful in order to apply this theory to a more specific single instance. I felt that it would only work if you could actually see it in a more focused way, in an individual, smaller period. The focus I chose is the artistic move in the late 16th century from the style we've labeled, we art historians have labeled in the past mannerism, to the style known as Baroque. This shift took place in Bologna, a northern Italian city that was not in the 16th century, nor is it even now, considered a particularly important city. In terms of artistic production, Florence, Rome, and Venice were the dominant places. Yet in the period that interests me, the last 30 years of the 16th century, Bologna did in fact become prominent for a number of reasons. And I believe this prominence that resulted in a greater openness to visitors of all sorts and the new ideas that arrived with them relates directly to changes in style that were successfully promoted by a family of young artists, the Carracci. In our terms, the existing state of differentiation in Bologna then gives way to greater centrality, achieving a balance between the two in the 1580s. That's what I would think if I could make these graphs. So my mantra is, artists do not work in a vacuum, hence the notion of fractals, right, running through all society. The Carracci, two brothers and a cousin, Annibale, Agostino, and Ludovico, wanted to change the rules. Right? And I think that that's what they tried to do, but it was very difficult in this period. So just to, in some ways, reiterate what David was saying, if we see the Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries as promoting a style relating to the Renaissance revival of classical ideals, art of the 16th century appears to be a reaction against the stable order and clarity of artists such as Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci. And I just wrote these three terms down because it's what I think is happening in the mid to the late 16th century. That is, you have this style that's a reaction against that classical order that much later art historians labeled mannerism. And as an aside, my field is now anti-label. So they don't want to talk about mannerism anymore, which I'm continuing to use because it's useful right now. They can't figure out what else to call what happens in the 16th century anyway. But what happens with the Carracci and some other artists that begin to work in the 17th century is what we could think of as naturalism. It is a kind of response to mannerism, which is anti-natural, anti-realist. And it's this shift and this trying to deal with the mannerism through naturalism, through returning eventually leads to what we then call the Baroque in the 17th century. Here's an example that David was referring to. If you've seen one Raphael Madonna, you've seen them all. So I didn't actually bring in, this is a Madonna, but it's more highly peopled. And so just to make the point of clarity, you've got this pyramidal composition that's extremely stable. You have a background that's very clearly mapped out through the use of what they call linear perspective or even scientific perspective, a real clarity of color. You can read this whole painting quite easily. But I wanted to show that Raphael, who if he had lived longer would have gone through exactly the same stages, I think, that that Michelangelo and Leonardo went through, because they lived a long time. He died relatively young, in his early 30s. He was commissioned to paint this work when he was working in Rome. And the Saint Cecilia was commissioned by a patron in Bologna, a monastery. And it arrived shortly after it was finished in 1514 and was housed in a church that was open to the public. What interests me is that when it arrived, the artists working in the Bolognese region were still in the high Renaissance tradition. And so they looked at this and didn't quite know what to make of it, because it's a different kind of painting. And I realize for us today it's hard to see that in some ways. But he's been influenced by Michelangelo, as he was when he was working in the Vatican. And so his figures have a much different quality. They're more monumental. Even their poses, their facial details are much more serious. It's a very different atmosphere that he creates. And I would say a little bit darker and more gloomy. The actual painting is much brighter than you see it here. Of course, reproductions never do it justice. But the reason I also wanted to show you this is that this was tremendously important later on, when people were looking for a way to get beyond a mannerism and thinking about a more monumental and stable construction. When we talk about mannerism, the clear perspective construction gives way to a representation of space that is difficult to read, to human figures that appear contorted and exaggerated in their proportions, and a narrative that is frequently confusing, esoteric, or obviously erotic. Through much of the 16th century in Italy, artists struggled with versions of this maniera, or mannerism. And probably one of the most famous examples of mannerism is Parmigianino's Madonna of the Long Neck, which he stopped working on in 1540 when he died. It's actually somewhat unfinished. He worked on it from 1534 to 1540. And this is an example of what we can point to clearly as an artist having been traumatized by something that happened in his lifetime, and that was the sack of Rome in the 1520s. And it not only traumatized artists working in Rome, but in other parts of Italy, because those troops came in and ravaged the countryside and the cities as they moved. And in fact, he fled from Rome and went back to the Bolognese region. He was from Parma, but there was an artist he couldn't compete with in Parma at the time. So he settled in Bologna for a while and left a lot of drawings and prints there. And it clearly had an influence on the artists working in Bologna after him. And just to make a point about the perspective is totally skewed. You have this gigantic Madonna, it's a very big painting, with this tiny little figure here. I don't know if you can make it out. Tiny little figure. It's a prophet who's reading on a scroll what his prophecy was, and it's of course relating to the death of Christ. Angels here, these are angel figures, but they look like erotic boys, although they're considered to be androgynous, holding a very elongated Greek vase, and all of their sinuous curves, the Madonna, the child, the angels, all relate to that. So in effect, the proportion is exaggerated, the proportion of the bodies, of the perspective, the whole thing is skewed, but makes a tremendous impression on the viewer because of that monumentality.